ग्लोबल स्किल डेवलपमेंट मिशन में आपका स्वागत है।
One final topic that I want to cover related to color before we move on to imagery is color spaces, understanding color spaces. Now, what exactly is a color space? Well, all it is a way for describing color. There's a handful of them. We're going to focus in on two of them in this exercise, the two most important color spaces. If you want, you can think of a color space as a language. What does human language do? It expresses or communicates ideas and thoughts and, things of this nature. So a color space is the same idea. It simply communicates or describes color. Okay? Now, the two color spaces that we're going to zero in on in this exercise are RGB, and that stands for red, green, and blue. And the second color space that we're going to talk about is CMYK, and that's shorthand for cyan, magenta, yellow, and the K on the end is for black. Okay, now, as I say, there are a handful of other color spaces, but these are the two most important. So let's take a look at each of these in turn. We're going to start off with RGB. Okay, so RGB, again, it's shorthand for red, green, and blue. What we see here on screen, by the way, is the color panel from Photoshop. Now, a lot of graphics applications, doesn't have to be an Adobe product, but a lot of graphics applications have a similar panel like this, okay? Now, in Photoshop's case, and also in Illustrator's case as well, by the way, the color panel can be set to different color modes. So I'm simply using the color panel to help us along here. And as you can see inside the color panel, we have a red slider, a green slider, and a blue slider, all right? Now, the RGB color space is what's referred to as an additive color space. In other words, we can add these three colors together to create millions and millions of other colors. The RGB color space is used specifically on screen, so any kind of digital design. Think web design or DVD interfaces or presentations. Any kind of design that's going to be viewed on screen is going to use the RGB color space. Now, back to these three sliders for a second, the R, G, and B sliders. Each of these sliders is a sliding scale from 0 to 255. So, in other words, each of these sliders has 256 levels. So, 256 levels for R, or red, 256 levels for green, and 256 levels for blue. Now, when I'm describing how the RGB color space works, here's the analogy that I was given years and years back, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. What I want you to do is I want you to imagine you're standing in front of three giant spotlights. A red spotlight, a green spotlight, and a blue spotlight. If all of the spotlights are turned off, then you would be in complete darkness. And as you can see here inside the Photoshop color panel, the RGB sliders are all set to 0. You can see 0 right down the board there on the right-hand side of this color panel. And notice that the color swatch over in the top left corner is solid black. Okay? Now, if I go and turn on the red spotlight to 100% intensity, as high as it'll go, 255 all the way up, then you're going to be bathed, if you will, in a solid red color. Okay? And then, if I crank up the blue spotlight as high as it'll go, all the way up to 255, then you're going to be standing in kind of a magenta, sort of a pinkish color. This is what we mean by RGB being an additive color space. Okay? Now, if I crank up the third spotlight, the green spotlight, as high as he can go, so all three spotlights are at full intensity, 255 for each, you're going to be in solid white light. Okay? So RGB is using light, if you want to think of it that way. Okay? All right, so that's the RGB color space. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the color panel, again, either inside Photoshop or Illustrator or inside one of your other graphics applications. We can oftentimes switch the color panel to use a different set of sliders. In my case here, I'm going to switch over to, you guessed it, CMYK sliders. Okay, so now CMYK sliders populate the color panel. All right, so CMYK, don't forget, it stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and the wacky one is the K on the end. That stands for black, don't forget. Now, CMYK is the opposite to RGB. It isn't additive, it's subtractive. Imagine an artist mixing paints together on his palette, okay? And the CMYK color space is used in print. So if you're going to be designing flyers and posters and CD covers and all this kind of stuff, anything that's going to be commercially printed is going to be in the CMYK color space. Now, inside the color panel, you can see we have a slider for each of our color values, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, all the way down. Instead of having a sliding scale from 0 to 255, as we saw with RGB, CMYK uses a scale of 0 to 100% for each of our colors. So again, imagine mixing paints together. So I could put 100% cyan down onto my canvas, and I'm going to get 100% cyan. Imagine that. If I take 100% cyan and I mix it with 100% yellow, we saw this earlier, this gives us green, something like this. Or I can mix in different percentages of other colors. I could go 20% cyan, give me 80% magenta, 20% yellow, and don't give me any black. And that's going to give me kind of this pink, sort of this magenta color. Okay? So that's how the CMYK color space works. So there you go. Again, I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. There's a lot more to it than this, but I'm trying to keep it short and sweet for you. And there are other color spaces, as I had mentioned a couple of times already. But the biggies are RGB, red, green, and blue, used on screen. CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, used in print.